So here's Act 1, the beginnings. The idea of European integration, of course, goes back a very long way, perhaps even to William Penn in the 17th century, certainly to, for example, Aristide Briand, the leading French politician in the 1920s. But I want to start our story with the European coal and steel community in the immediate post-war period. It's actually launched in 1950. Now, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the victorious Allies, and certainly the French, had an idea about keeping Germany down, deindustrializing Germany, making Germany a pastoralized country, in the words of the Morgenthau Plan, named after Franklin Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary. But very soon, the Allies, and particularly the British and the Americans, began to realize that economically a weak Germany was bad for Europe, and politically, in the context of the developing Cold War, a weak West Germany was bad for the West as a whole. And the French, reluctantly at first, had come to accept this idea by 1948 or so. And the French had been very, very keen to get hold of as much as they could of Germany's natural resources, in particular coal, iron ore. And suddenly they feel sort of rather undercut. And they could have become rather surly and rather resentful, but instead they, with some American encouragement, embraced the idea of not just allowing Germany to reconstruct, but to allow Germany to reconstruct within the context of a full-blown reconciliation. And that's the start of the coal and steel community, launched in 1950 by the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman, backed by the Chief Planning Commissioner of France, Jean Monnet, but also very readily accepted by the Chancellor of the brand new Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. It's only existed since 1949, Konrad Adenauer. And the idea of the coal and steel community was to put in common the resources of continental Europe's, at least Western Europe's, coal and steel, so that each nation should be able to have ready access to them. Why coal and steel? Because in 1950 they're still seen as the primary, the key materials for making war. So if you put them in common, runs the idea, war between France and Germany, these historic enemies, becomes not just unthinkable, but actually practically impossible. France and Germany, of course, in the signature of the treaty in Paris in 1951, are then joined by 4 other countries: Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Italy. So France, Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries form the 6 in the European coal and steel community. Now, the coal and steel community is quite a limited organisation, and in some ways it doesn't do terribly well in its ostensible purpose, which is to develop the production of coal and steel at a European level. But it's still immensely important. And I think it's important for perhaps 3 reasons. Reason A is the combination of a political purpose and an economic purpose. The political purpose is clearly European reconciliation, and it's very much backed by the United States. And it's quite ambitious. It's not just reconciliation, it's really unification of Europe, or at least in this Cold War context, of Western Europe. Alongside that is the economic purpose, that is to say, of developing coal and steel production. Point B that makes this important is the 6, this notion of a core Western European group around France and Germany, and not the UK, which in 1950 was Europe's biggest steel producer still. The British are invited in, but choose to stay out, and Jean Monnet, on the whole, doesn't regret that too much, because Monnet thinks that actually the European integration process at this point might get off to a better start without the British. So this is the first of many occasions when the British chose to stand aside. Point 3, and this needs a bit more development, is to do with the institutions and the principles underlying them. The coal and steel community developed 4 institutions to manage it. These institutions struck a balance between 2 principles, known in Eurospeak as 1, supranationality, and 2, intergovernmentalism. What do they mean? Supranationality means that a European organisation has to have some institutions that stand above the constituent nations, that take initiatives on a European, not just a national basis. Intergovernmentalism means the governments of the member states going in there and defending their own national interests. And Europe has always been a balance between these 2 principles. More specifically, the institutions of the new coal and steel community are essentially 4-fold. 2 of them are very clearly supranational. One of them is called the High Authority. That is a group of commissioners, if you like, appointed by the member states, yes, but committed to acting in the European interest, not going into bat for their respective governments. And the High Authority's job is to propose initiatives to complete, to develop the coal and steel community. Second supranational institution is the Court of Justice. That is a court that's there to resolve any disputes between nations or even between individuals or companies and nations that arise out of the operation of the coal and steel community. And the Court of Justice has a binding role in the limited sphere of action of the coal and steel community. So you've got 2 supranational institutions. Then you've got one institution which is very clearly intergovernmental. It's called the Council of Ministers. In the Council of Ministers, ministers from the respective member states meet to agree on, or to reject, if they want, the proposals emanating from the High Authority. And it's expected that the ministers in the Council of Ministers will certainly try and agree among themselves, but they'll represent their national interests and try and get the best possible deal for their respective governments. The final institution of the 4 is the Assembly of the Coal and Steel Community. Purely consultative, it doesn't have any decision-making powers at this stage, and it consists of delegates of the respective national parliaments who are invited to take positions, to even to vote on the various proposals that come from the High Authority. They can't block them, but they can make their opinion known very forcefully. And those are the institutions as they're set up by the Treaty of Paris in 1951, and they provide a sort of template for the way the European Union is going to develop in later decades. One final word before we end this Act 1 of the process, and that is we need to make a distinction between the development of the European Union on the one hand and the Council of Europe on the other hand. These are 2 quite separate institutions, and I'm not going to talk about the Council of Europe this afternoon. The Council of Europe was set up before the Treaty of Paris and dealt on a wider European basis with cultural exchanges and later human rights. In due course, it developed the European Court of Human Rights. This is a quite separate setup from the institutions that are going to flow into the European Union, even though in the course of time bridges have been built between the two. But Council of Europe, European Court of Human Rights, they're not part of our argument here. They're not part of the referendum that took place in the UK on the 23rd of June 2016. Here ends Act 1.